Good afternoon, scaredy cats. Hope you enjoy the video today and please like, comment, and subscribe. Today's shout out goes to Mother Mayhem 15. Thanks for the support. These stories are for you. Hope you enjoy. 1. Out of range. I work as an executive in a pretty prominent business. I won't mention it, but just know that my job is very, very stressful and takes up nearly all of my free time. I do get a couple weeks of vacation every year. When I take it, I tend to go out and spend all of my time by myself. It's exactly what I need in order to recharge my batteries and get myself back in the frame of mind for work. Nowadays, I take my vacations in urban areas. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, I used to take my vacations in the hills. I would rent a nice cabin in the middle of nowhere and then just spend all my time alone. After 2 weeks of this, I was so ready to get back to work with enough energy to last for another year. I'll tell you why I don't do this anymore. A few years back, I was very, very exhausted. I rented a nice secluded cabin and was getting ready to have a nice time just reading a few good books by the fire. I don't want to mention exactly where this happened, but I can tell you it was very far from civilization. I preferred this because I got to see more wildlife. But also, it was too far out for any real contact with the outside world. The company I rented the cabin from was in the closest town, over an hour and a half drive down the mountain from the cabin. There were no phone lines or even a radio. The only way that I could communicate would be to get in my truck and drive to town. Now, there were other cabins in the hills in this area. So although it wasn't usual, it was completely possible to see someone out in the woods. A few days into my vacation, I was sitting on the porch reading a book and having a drink. This was around mid-morning or noon. I heard a noise off in the distance and really didn't think about it too much. But when I heard more of a rustling, I finally turned in the direction of the noise. I noticed that there was a person out in the trees. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, and I assumed he was just a hiker. When he noticed that I noticed him, he raised his hand and gave me a wave. I gave a friendly wave back. He was the first person I had seen in a few days, and I have to admit it was nice to not think I was the only person in the world. He walked off and I went back to reading my book. I wasn't really paying attention to the time passing. However, I had gotten through a substantial portion of the book before I once again heard a rustling in the woods. This time, I looked up at the first noise. It was the man from before, and he was in the same place as before. I acknowledged him with a nod of my head. This time, though, he didn't nod back or wave or anything like that. He just stood there and stared at me. I mean, it may have seemed longer to me than it was, but it seemed like the guy was watching me for quite a long time. Finally, he left again. I wasn't sure what to think about what happened. I was slightly unnerved, but I still had no reason to be worried. A guy staring at you for a few moments could be for any reason whatsoever. But I decided it was weird enough that I no longer wanted to be outside on the porch. I grabbed my book and my drink, went into the house. Even though I felt like a ninny doing it, I locked the front door also. The rest of the day went fine without me hearing or seeing anything again. But around 10 p.m. that night, I heard some odd sounds coming from the driveway. Remembering seeing that guy around, I got a little nervous. I went and took my flashlight and went onto the porch. I shined the light around, trying to see if the guy had come back again. I walked around to the side of the cabin and the back, looking all around. I saw some movement among some bushes, and even though I had no reason to believe that it might have been him, I did get a bit apprehensive. I hurried back in the house and locked the door. I have to admit being a bundle of nerves. But I had some scotch and knew I would feel better after having a couple drinks. Well, I did a bit more than that, I guess. In fact, I got so tipsy that I stumbled into my room and passed out. I got up a couple hours later and got up to go pee. I walked through the living and to the bathroom, not turning on any of the lights. I peed, went back to bed. Of course, I woke up in the morning with a headache. I was lucky I was on vacation, so I didn't have to do much. I got up and walked into the living room. Two things caught my attention. First, my front door was unlocked. Second, there was not tacked to the front door. It read simply, "You might want to keep a light on." You walked right by me for your piss break. Needless to mention, I left the cabin that day and have never gone back to the hills that it took place in. 2. Scary travel stories from a haunted cabin. When it comes to creepy road trip stories and travel horror stories, this is by far my most terrifying. When I was growing up, my family owned a cabin in Hancock, New York, in the Catskills. It was mainly used for hunting, but we'd also drive up there to hike, ride quads, make campfire s'mores, and just be in nature. This cabin was small. It was actually a trailer that was affixed into the ground and then added onto slightly. Because of this, my cousin and I would share a big bed in the main part of the trailer, and my dad would sleep on the couch, but we were all virtually in the same room. One night when I was about 10, I woke up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night and saw a man standing at the end of the bed staring at me. I knew instantly he was a ghost, as he was translucent and was dressed like he was from the mid-1800s. Quickly, I threw the cover over my head and squeezed next to my cousin, terrified. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew I was on the floor of the trailer, next to the couch. I could hear my dad snoring loudly, but every time I tried to reach out to wake him up, something would grab my hand and pull it back. The next morning, I woke up on the floor of the trailer with my hands over my head. I woke up in an even weirder position the following night, when my cousin and I awoke with the bed covered in vomit. It was from me, but I had no recollection of throwing up, and I'd never thrown up in my sleep before. But, wait, didn't you say in the title that there were multiple scary travel stories? Yes, and that's where things get even more creepy. The next 2 times that I went to the cabin, I ended up waking up covered in my own vomit, with barely any recollection of throwing up. This is something that had never happened to me before, but yet it was happening constantly at the cabin. Eventually we sold the cabin, though years later I was told that a family member once claimed to see a UFO landing in the yard when he got up to use the toilet at 3 a.m. Even now, over 20 years after the incident, I still remember it vividly, and I firmly believe that cabin is possessed by something inhuman. Many people imagine injuries and lost passports when thinking about travel horror stories, but for me, it's definitely this. 3. My cabin in the woods story. Hey everyone, so I just discovered this channel yesterday and thought I'd tell a weird story that happened to me and my ex-girlfriend. So my family owns a cabin on a small lake up in New Hampshire. We go there every summer. It's basically our home away from home. There are other houses on the lake, quite a few near us, but beyond that it's a pretty rural area. Miles of woods stretch beyond the lake houses, so there's really no reason to be in the area unless you were hunting, own a lake house, or were visiting the lake for whatever reason. So one night, maybe 6 years ago, it was late, probably around midnight. My ex and I were laying in bed just chatting about whatever. All of a sudden we hear footsteps outside the open window. The window lays only about halfway up on the wall to the side of the bed, and is situated so that it opens right at the bottom of the bed where our feet are. The ground around my house is covered in a layer of pine needles that drop from above, so it's pretty hard to walk quietly. But the footsteps sounded like whatever was making them were trying their best to not be heard. They sounded relatively close, but we rationalized to ourselves that they were probably made from some sort of animal. A couple of minutes go by and we hear them again, except this time they seemed closer. They seemed to be right outside the window, still trying to move quietly. At this point, the two of us are starting to get a little freaked out. To our mutual horror, we look down and see a hand slowly coming through the window. Obviously, we screamed and woke the house up, and my parents come running out of their adjacent room. We tell them what happened, and my father rationalizes it as the event being a figment of our imaginations. To this day, I don't know if he's right. The weird thing is that both my ex and I saw the same thing, so how could it be our imaginations? To this day, I feel uneasy staying in that room, and I always make sure to shut the window before I go to bed. 4. Family cabin. I remember when I was growing up that my father used to take us to a cabin that his aunt owned. Our time there was always short, but it was always enjoyable. I always enjoyed hiking and playing in the woods. However, around the time I was 12 years old, we stopped going. When I turned 25, I heard about my aunt passing away. At the reading of her will, she had left the cabin to me. I was surprised as I had gotten older and really hadn't thought of it very much. However, inheriting it made me so curious about what condition it had been in since I had last seen it. I didn't have vacation time, so I wasn't able to go and see the cabin right away. However, about 6 months after inheriting it, I went on my way to check it out. It was nice driving up through the woods, seeing how much had actually not changed. The cabin wasn't set too far off the dirt road. The driveway was maybe about 4 car lengths long. I tell you this because I was able to see the cabin from the street. When I got to the still familiar driveway, I slowed and was about to turn. However, I stopped when I saw that someone was sitting on the porch swing. In what had to be split-second timing, and the guy must not have seen me, I straightened the wheel out and kept driving up the road. I pulled off to the side and took out the paperwork. I wanted to make sure that I had gotten the right address. There were other cabins in the area, and it had been over a decade since I had seen it. However, I confirmed that the cabin was, in fact, mine. After thinking about it, I thought I'd just pull into the driveway and have a chat with the guy. I mean, there must have been some reason he was there. Maybe he knew my aunt or something. Turning around, I went back in the other direction. However, as I got closer to the cabin, I felt my heart beating pretty loud. I was never one much for confrontation. As I got back to the driveway, I found myself unable to turn the wheel into the driveway. I had slowed down, but when I noticed the guy was still on the porch, I decided that it would be best for me to drive back into town and ask for the police to check it out. Yeah, I know it seemed like a bit of an overreaction. And I felt like a total coward for doing it. But best to err on the side of caution. I went to the police station, explained what had happened, and asked them if they could take a drive out to the cabin. They were fine with that and told me I could either wait there or in the local cafe for them. I let them know I'd go to the cafe. The ride from the town to the cabin wasn't too long, really. But it seemed like the cops had been gone for a very long time. However, finally, after a couple hours, I saw the officer I had talked to earlier enter the cafe. He looked over at me and came to sit down. He opened a folder and showed me a picture, asking me if the picture was of the man I had seen on the porch. I confirmed that it definitely looked like the guy. The officer told me when they went back to the cabin, he noticed them and ran into the cabin. But they approached the cabin and eventually had to knock the door open. The man resisted them, so they had to handcuff him. They had to run some information and discovered the man was wanted in California for killing his girlfriend. We were in West Virginia, so I guess he had thought he had gotten far enough away that he could just hang out on the porch without anyone recognizing him. He had been at the cabin for a few months, assuming it was abandoned. When he saw the cop car coming, he figured that the police had found him. He had no idea they didn't know who he was. I have no idea if the man would have done anything to me had I actually driven up there. However, the guy was convicted of the murder, so there's no telling. I always thank God that I was too nervous to drive up there. 5. Haunted. This story seems a bit typical at first. I am one of those people who has never believed in the supernatural. Or at least, perhaps I believed when I was a child. But I grew out of those beliefs when I got older. I just didn't see any evidence for it. And when I quit believing in ghosts, I of course was less scared of what goes bump in the night. I rented a cabin with my best friend from high school during my second year of college. We went to different colleges, but we made sure that we would come back together and spend time with each other in the summer. The first year everything went fine. We went on a road trip. However, the second summer, I was a bit too tired to do that. Finals had killed me, and I just wanted to find a place to relax. Jack's idea was to rent a cabin out in the woods and maybe do some local fishing. We came to the cabin, sight unseen. Neither of us were disappointed, though. The place was quite beautiful. And we had a really good first day and first night there. The second morning, however, I got up and went into the kitchen. I had bought myself several microwave sandwiches for breakfast. Someone had obviously opened the box up and taken one of the sandwiches. I didn't care. Jack was my best friend, so it didn't bother me if he wanted my food. However, later in the day, when I asked him how it was, he indicated that he hadn't taken it. I figured at first that he either did and forgotten it or that he just didn't want to tell me. So that's minor, right? Well, the second night I woke up because I heard Jack moving around in the living room. He normally slept like a rock and had a bladder as secure as Fort Knox, so I was surprised. I called out and asked him if anything was wrong but didn't get an answer. The following day, another one of my sandwiches were missing and I figured this was just a joke from Jack, who both insisted he didn't take one of the sandwiches and that he hadn't been up in the middle of the night. I really thought Jack was just messing with me. That was until that night. I was sleeping when I heard a creaking sound, which woke me up. I immediately looked over to my bedroom door and saw that it was slightly open. Someone behind the door was partly visible and then slammed the door. I got up, ran into the living room, expecting to catch Jack after peeking in the room at me. But he wasn't in the living room. I walked down the hallway to his room and his door was slightly open. Looking in, I noticed that he was sound asleep. I checked around the cabin, found all the windows and the doors were secured so no one could have gotten into the cabin. I had to go back to bed, having discovered nothing. It was tough getting back to sleep that night though. In the morning, I discussed it with Jack, who insisted he had not gotten up during the night and if he would have, he definitely wouldn't have been peeking in on me. I didn't suspect Jack was either gay and trying to catch me naked, something he had seen several times anyway, nor that he was some strange stalker who looked into people's rooms when they were unaware. So he brought up the idea that maybe the cabin was haunted. I laughed that off, of course, not believing in such things. But I guess for the first time in my life, I began thinking about it. And by the time I went to bed, I had really worked myself up into a mood where I was worried and couldn't get any sleep. After tossing and turning for about an hour or so, I decided to get up and get myself a snack. Sometimes a hot meal did a lot to help me sleep. Sleepily, I walked over to my bedroom and opened it. Immediately, across the room, I saw something moving. It stopped moving when I opened the door and quickly disappeared, and I heard a slamming noise. I ran over to the light, flipped it on, and when I did, I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before. There was a cellar door in the living room area. I put two and two together quickly. I ran, took the couch and pushed it over the cellar door before running into Jack's room to tell him what I had seen. Someone was in the cellar of the cabin and had been coming out at night. I told him about the couch. Jack was a really big, muscular guy and he went immediately and sat down on the couch while I went to the phone and called the police. This was a vacation cabin, but it wasn't too far out of town. The police were there within half an hour. They brought the person out from the cellar, only to reveal it was a very skinny and sickly-looking woman. She had been living in that cellar for a while, stealing food from the people who had rented it. It turned out she was a schizophrenic woman who had been in and out of psychiatric wards. She was returned to one right after. I doubt she would have been able to harm us if she had wanted to. She was just trying to survive. But it was scary thinking that while we slept, she had been walking around the cabin eating our food.